Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are ya? This has been the year from hell. So far, it's involved 3 ER trips, 2 hospitalizations for 1 family member, I totaled my car, and so many other little tragedies of stupidity that I can't even relate them all. In short, 2023 wants to be remembered as one of those years. You know, the kind where everyone who knows you wrinkles their nose because they remember. Oh, do they remember? In keeping with 2023's surprises and interruptions of plans, I am sad to announce that The Black Arrival will not begin its podcast run until late October or early November, which leaves us a hole in the schedule. Since I hate the podcast going dark, I've dug through my archives and have found the original podcast version of my first novel, Closet Treats. Hopefully that will carry you through to the next book in the series. The good news is that after this, there should be no more interruptions between now and the end of the Black series. Just remember, I said should. Apart from that, Neptune's Scars is at Severed Press, and Ancient Trap is at the editor, and I'm doing what I can with audio while I get back to writing. Guess I better do that. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 21 of The Black.
Chapter 9. They'd started out with a crew of 80. Now, they were down to 5 roughnecks, a wounded rig chief, a geologist, an engineer, and a smart-ass tech. Losing Gomez was the worst of it. Vrabel still couldn't believe his old friend was gone, and worse, couldn't believe he hadn't been able to save him. But like Shauna had said, Gomez had been dead for hours. He just hadn't known it. The geologist sat next to him as he downed a bottle of water and consumed one of the energy bars. "I don't know how it happened," she said, "but JP was infected. Your 3 mud specialists were infected. Somehow Gomez was infected when it touched him." Vrabel tried to focus on her words, but his mind still felt barely attached to his body. Every few minutes the world tried to swim away from him, and he bit his tongue to keep hold of it. The water cooled his throat and made the faux peanut buttery, chalky taste of the energy bar somehow palatable. "You think anyone that comes in contact with this stuff gets infected?" She shrugged. "I don't know, but I think we need to be more careful. I'm not a biologist, and when I examined the oil in the lab, I wasn't looking for biological markers. Also, I didn't exactly have access to the right equipment." Vrabel chuckled. "PPE spent all this money and didn't provide a large enough lab for you? Lady, you are hard to please." She grinned. "Sorry, I'll make sure Calhoun puts a request in for the next rig." "Next rig. I'm never fucking leaving land again," Vrabel said. Even Calhoun laughed at that. The old man had started to look better. Vrabel guessed the engineer had just needed a rest and some food. It was past afternoon now, the storm bearing down on them. Barely any sunlight made it through the bruised and purple gauzy sky. They'd surrounded the drill table with the remaining halogens. As Bill and the remaining crew began the wire line operations in earnest, Vrabel and Catfish had loaded the explosive shots on a dolly and pushed them over to the drill table. Shauna and Calhoun kept watch over the superstructure, their flashlights dancing in the darkness. He knew they couldn't hurt the Black from this distance, but at least they could give the drill crew a heads up. Considering the creatures seemed to be less and less afraid of the light, Vrabel wasn't sure how they were going to survive the storm. When the light completely died in the sky, the dinner bell would start ringing. He tried not to think about it as he stood off to the side and watched his men. My men, he thought. What's left of them, anyway? They hadn't heard from Subkoviak since last night. Vrabel had to assume the portly doctor was dead. Belmont and his crew had been off shift. Had the Black gotten them as well? Catfish sat cross-legged beneath one of the platforms, finger dancing over his laptop. The rain barely touched him where he sat, but Vrabel had noticed him wiping the screen more than once. He really hoped the long-haired asshole knew what he was doing. If Calhoun was right, they might at least be able to take care of what was below the ocean floor. What the engineer had postulated was insane. Cthulhu-type shit. But he was right about one thing. If they weren't able to give the CDC the all-clear, they were fucked. After what he'd seen and experienced, no one could afford to allow the Black onto land. Hell, it couldn't even be allowed back in the ocean. If Vrabel was in charge of the CDC, he'd drop a goddamn bomb on the rig. One of those fuel air things that nuked every living thing. Living thing, he thought. Yes, that's what the black was. The 5 remaining deck crew members loaded another explosive shot into the pipe. Considering the drill string was over 5 miles long, it took a long time for the shots to drop to the bottom. He figured they had time for one more before the storm finally killed the remaining daylight. He glanced over at Catfish. The man was perspiring as he typed. He might be a shitbag, but Vrabel didn't envy him his task. If the tech didn't program his robot friends correctly, then none of this would work. "Vrabel?" Calhoun asked. Over the sounds of the engines and the storm, the man's voice seemed less gruff and less confident. Vrabel turned and stared at him. Calhoun's eyes were bright and focused, but he still didn't look well. "What's up?" The large man tapped his foot on the desk. "You ready to help with the flares?" Vrabel hissed through his teeth. "This plan of yours is crazy." Calhoun nodded. "I know, but you didn't answer my question." A grin slowly spread across Vrabel's face. "I just wanted to say that again before I started taking part in it." "I can live with that," Calhoun said. "Come on." They walked from the drill string area and toward the storage bunkers at the rig's edge. A workbench for fixing pipe problems and cleaning tools was affixed to one of the steel structures. At least the overhang would protect them from the rain. 5 flares were spread across the bench's rubber mat. "How do you know they won't, catch fire when we start doing this?" "Because magnesium needs a flame. Just make sure you don't cause sparks while we're cutting into them," Calhoun said. Vrabel chuckled. "I'll do my best." He clapped Calhoun on the shoulder. "Let's get to work." The AUV bay was far enough beneath the rig for him to actually hear himself think. Coding while sitting next to the drill table had been tough, but he'd managed to at least get most of the new instructions ready. He still thought Calhoun was out of his mind, but what was the harm in trying to kill a subterranean ocean floor monster? We could only die once, right? He rubbed at his eyes. God, he was tired. Every few minutes, the code on the screen became blurry gibberish, and he had to close his eyes to reset his brain. Considering what they were about to do and how long it was going to take, sleep wasn't on the agenda anytime soon. Besides, who could sleep while those things were looking for a meal? Shauna stood behind him on the platform, staring up the steps to the rig deck. She was the lookout. The AUV bay was one of the brightest parts of the ship when the lights were turned on. If one of those things came down the steps, it was going to meet something akin to sunlight. AUV-2 was permanently fucked. With the damaged ballast and screw housing, it wasn't going back in the water. It was good for nothing except parts and testing. Testing is exactly why he'd removed its outer casing. He loaded the program into its brain and checked for data corruption. Nope, all good. AUV-2 sent back a ping it was ready for insertion. Catfish told the AUV to start its dive. He'd set the engine driving the propellers into diagnostic mode to trick the AUV into thinking the engines were working. The laptop sent false pressure readings to its sensors. The robot thought it was descending beneath the ocean. The screen lit up with a 3D depth pressure grid, including the robot's position. The AUV thought it was nose down and diving like hell for the bottom. Catfish raised his arms above his head and yawned. "Stay awake, Code Boy," Shauna called from behind him. He shook his head. "Sleep? Here? Why would I want to do that?" He put the laptop on its stand and turned to her. Shauna's clothes were grimy and stained, and her khakis were torn in more than a few places. Streaks of blood had welled from her skin onto both her shirt and pants. "You look like shit." "Whatever," she grinned. "You're just as much a mess as I am." "Uh-huh," he said. "There's blood in your hair." Her grin faded. "Yeah, I tried to wash it out in the rain, but I guess I just didn't get it all." He shook his head. "I wish someone could wash what I saw out of my brain." She didn't reply. Shauna glanced upward at the deck and Catfish followed her gaze. The roughnecks had been working for hours now, and night might as well have fallen. Somewhere up in the sky, behind the thick blankets of black clouds, the sun still shined. But down here, there was nothing but murk and water. "You understand what they're doing?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "And what they're doing is probably going to blow the drill string." "Fuck, that's the best idea I've heard all day." She turned and her smile was back. A little sad, but still a smile. "The shots are weighted, and so is the drill string. When they rotate the table and drop the weight, the drill bit will sink back into the spud sight. Then I guess they'll hit the button and boom. If Calhoun is right, it should blow the bit further down and possibly rip a hole large enough for your AUV. If, he said. That's a wonderful word, isn't it? It means this could work. Or we could be fucked. She giggled. That's what I love about you, Catfish. You're a charter member of the We're on the Verge of Getting Killed club. He sighed and turned back to the laptop. The timer showed another 10 minutes. He wasn't sure he could wait that long, but he needed to let the sim run. If he was wrong, they really would be fucked. You think this will work? He asked. I mean the flares. Magnesium burns. It doesn't care about water. It cares about a flashpoint. And once it starts, it's damn difficult to get it to stop. So yeah, I think it'll work. I smell an if, he said. She rolled her eyes. Okay, fine. If your robot does its job. If the hole is big enough. And if something else doesn't go wrong. He smiled. See, that's what I wanted to hear. So, Ms. Geologist, still interested in rocks? Yes, she said, but only if they're on dry land and 1,000 miles away from the ocean. Calhoun thinks it's some prehistoric creature. What do you think? I don't know, she said. I'd have a better idea if I knew what Houston found. She shook her head. Let me rephrase that. I'd love to know the results of their tests. You mean before the quarantine? Right, she said. Before it did whatever it did. The image of some poor lab tech opening a barrel filled with tentacles, pincers, and teeth made him shudder. He suddenly didn't feel like talking anymore. From the look on Shauna's face, he was pretty damn sure she'd imagined the same thing. Catfish tried to clear his mind, but JP's face kept sliding across his vision. His friend, the man who'd taught him how to dive, spearfish, and enjoy the ocean, had been that thing's meal, or carrier, or whatever. He was dead, and the only thing Catfish could vent his anger and loss on was the creature below the ocean floor. And goddammit, he was going to blow that shit up. His laptop beeped and he turned to the screen. The timer was flashing. 55 seconds left. Here we go, he said. Shauna walked down a few steps to watch. He gave her a wink and turned back to the screen. The seconds ticked off. When the timer hit 0, the view on the screen zoomed in. A blocky AUV floated near a vertical line. Catfish switched to the console. And now for the boom. He typed in a command, hit return, and switched back to the diagram. The vertical line jumped down. The floor below it seemed to cave in. The AUV remained motionless. He gritted his teeth and checked the sensor logs. AUV-2 thought it had detected a massive seismic event. So why wasn't it? There we go, he said. The AUV icon moved toward the gash and slipped under it. And a metallic click echoed off the steel walls and a sizzling sound followed. The front scoop of AUV-2 burned with intense white light. Catfish exhaled a long breath and then started to giggle. Oh, Mr. Monster, I am going to fuck you up. The medical bay had been pitch black for hours. Subkowiak had fallen asleep in one of the beds, but only until the fire alarms went off. After that, he was wide awake and waiting to die. He had already decided to take care of himself before Smoke or Flame could with a nice overdose of morphine, enough to stop his heart before he had a chance to suffocate or burn to death. It'll be like going to sleep, he told himself. Only you'll never wake up in this nightmare again. So he'd put the syringe on the instrument table and kept it close to the bed. And if he didn't get a chance to use it, well, then it would be over quickly anyway. His phone was charged and sitting on his chest. As soon as the lights had gone out, he'd plugged it into the computer's battery backup. It still had quite a bit of juice left. He traded multiple emails with the CDC via PPE's email address. They confirmed that the same organism was loose in Houston. They had so far managed to confine it to the lab's building, but they weren't certain they could contain it. He told them about JP. He told them about the other 3 roughnecks that had been infected. He'd also told them what he saw in the stateroom. In a way, he wished he hadn't. They had stopped replying to his emails when he admitted he had no idea how to kill it. They'd used him for the information they needed, and after that there was no reason to keep talking. He could still try to communicate with Vrabel and the others, but didn't want to. If they were still alive, there was no reason for them to know that there wasn't going to be a rescue. Liger was quarantined. Thousands of miles from civilization and parked in over 5.5 miles of water, the world had nothing to fear from the infected rig, and Subkowiak was sure the CDC wanted to keep it that way. He tried to imagine the press release PPE would put out on the wire about their newest, most expensive toy. Would they claim Liger had sunk? Would they blame equipment? A tsunami? Negligent crew? Subkowiak sighed in the dark. The fire alarms had silenced some time ago. The only sound was the air conditioner. The doctor wondered just how long it would be before one of those things decided to enter the room through a vent. At least the smoke hadn't been too terrible, although the bay still smelled like burned plastic and wood. The surgical mask he'd worn while the smoke wafted through the vents had helped, but his lungs still felt like shredded cheese. The doc took a deep breath, nose wrinkling at the fetid air circulating through the room. At some point, he'd have to make a decision. He'd either stay in the rig until the end or try and find a way out of medical. The things were no longer scratching at the door, and he hadn't heard any movement in the vents for over an hour. "What are you doing?" he asked himself. "Preparing to die? Just staying in your little cage until what? The world ends?" He picked up the phone and turned on its flashlight. Subkowiak glanced around the room. He had multiple bottles of alcohol, but no way to ignite them. For the first time in his life, he wished he was a smoker. He rose from the hospital bed and walked 2 of the strong halogen lamps to within a few feet from the hatch. That done, he slid the UPS out from under the desk and put it between the lamps. In the dim light from the phone, he managed to plug the lamp's cords in. He turned them on and bright white light shined off the hatch. He adjusted the 2 lamp heads so their circles of light covered the bottom of the hatch. Although he had no way to create a flame, Subkowiak grabbed a bottle of alcohol anyway. The full plastic bottle felt heavy in his hands, but he knew that was a joke. Vrabel had told him the black burned like gasoline. Subkowiak thought of that message and had to shake his head. Even though Vrabel knew the doc was fucked, he was still trying to find a way to help his remaining crew. But the rig chief was kidding himself. There was no way out of this. At least Subkowiak could try to make it to the deck with the others, if they were still alive. He pocketed his phone and stood in front of the hatch. He put his ear to the metal and found it to be a little too warm. Subkowiak clucked his tongue. Could be the residual heat from the fire, or maybe that black shit was still trying to get in. Doc put the plastic bottle of alcohol in another pants pocket. It bit into his skin, but he hardly noticed. He put his pudgy hands on the metal wheel and took a deep breath. With a deep exhale, he spun it. The wheel squeaked, his already thumping heart increasing its beat at the sound. The wheel stopped spinning with a groan and a loud bang. He pulled open the door and peered into the hallway. The warped floor had buckled. The black had destroyed all the sheetrock and most of the studs holding up the ceiling. The overhead lights were out. His halogen lamps were the only ones still working. Subkowiak stared at the floor. There was no way it would hold his weight. He was completely trapped. He started to close the door and then stopped. Something moved in the wall. He aimed one of the halogens directly in front of him. The hallway filled with the sound of pork fat burning in a fryer. What he thought were shadows was the black. An entire river of it. It hung on the fractured, uneven wall like paint, bubbling and rippling as smoke rose off the illuminated spot. A gout of flame licked upward from the smoking swatch of black. The creature split itself into 3 pieces. A large ribbon moved one way, a larger ribbon the other. Detached from the large portions, a foot-wide sliver of darkness burned and crackled. Subkowiak shook his head and closed the hatch. He cycled the wheel until it stopped moving, turned his back to the door and slumped to the floor. There was nothing left. No way out. Nothing. He eyed the syringe of morphine sitting on the metal table by the medical bed. Sleep sounded like a good idea. With any luck, he'd be gone before the thing found a way to get to him. He turned off the halogens and walked to the bed to lie down. A little pinch from the syringe, and Doc took a flight into true darkness.